We wish to emphasize that all content you are about to see and hear within this film is presented strictly for educational purposes. The fundamental aim of this specific documentary, and of our entire channel as a whole, is to actively promote and spread historical understanding, while simultaneously condemning all forms of war crimes and oppressive totalitarian regimes.
The West is the one responsible for the Chernobyl disaster. A radioactive cloud is drawing near to their country. She supplied them with the best Soviet-made equipment: brooms, rags, and shovels. The day after the catastrophic nuclear accident at Chernobyl, the esteemed comrade Colonel Pikalov, a decorated hero of the Soviet Union and the chief of the Soviet Union's chemical forces, drove his truck directly through the main entrance gate of the power plant facility. His primary mission was to thoroughly investigate the radiation levels, because absolutely no one, not even his highest-ranking superiors, truly believed the levels were so incredibly high. When Pikalov saw the power plant's ruins, black radioactive smoke and graphite scattered everywhere on the ground, he knew that the day before a disaster had occurred, one that would be remembered as the greatest nuclear catastrophe in all of human history. He survived. He emerged unscathed. He was only briefly at the reactor. The liquidators and biorobots themselves could not have said the same. Heroes the cursed of the Soviet Union, people who stood directly face to face with an invisible enemy. And now, dear viewers, we would like to invite you on another historical journey.
The man was caught entirely off guard, completely taken aback by the suddenness of the moment. He was utterly unprepared for such an unexpected turn of events. He wasn't ready as a biological species. His natural apparatus, set to see, hear, and touch, didn't work. His eyes, ears, and fingers were no longer suitable. They couldn't serve him, because radiation is unseen, odorless, and makes no sound. It is bodiless.
Mother Russia wanted to cast her liquidators to the dustbin of history. They were no longer needed by her. And when it finally dawned on Gorbachev and the communist authorities the true scale of what was being discussed and what had truly occurred in Chernobyl, they began dispatching their apparatchiks to various towns and localities to disseminate propaganda. The objective was to showcase Soviet heroism and the Kremlin authorities' effective struggle against the deadly radiation. Panic and defeatism were considered punishable. No one was permitted to sow such sentiments. Of course, in the Kremlin, there were plenty of voices claiming that, in reality, the West was to blame for the Chernobyl catastrophe, because who else could it be? But the West, de facto, actually assisted the Soviet Union in covering up the whole affair. The official United Nations communique speaks of several dozen victims, but when it comes to Chernobyl, the true story isn't contained within official reports, but instead it lies in the tens of thousands of personal accounts from those who found themselves at the very epicenter of the Chernobyl disaster. Gorbachev was not an idiot. He knew that the accounts of the liquidators, what they had endured, those who found themselves on the very front lines in the battle against radiation, could lead to the Soviet public taking to the streets. They would be furious that the authorities had allowed the liquidators to remove such dangerous materials with their own bare hands. He also knew communism was barely breathing, yet he always spoke of a new opening with the West. So, during the Chernobyl catastrophe, the Soviet Union maintained its imperial image. Communism was barely breathing, but Chernobyl could have completely shattered communism in the minds of Soviet citizens. The liquidators, these were the people sent to the front lines to fight against the radiation. Dozens, if not hundreds of thousands of people were needed. How exactly were they called up for this? Chernobyl was a war, radiation a bigger enemy than the United States. That's why mobilization was ordered. From the Baltic countries alone, 20,000 people were called up. The radiation's effects were dealt with by Russians and citizens of practically all Soviet republics.
We held firm to lofty ideals, to the promise of our victory. We would overcome Chernobyl. We would charge into the fray and triumph. We were exhilarated, devouring stories of the heroic struggle against the reactor, that had broken free from human command. It was imperative that we prevent panic from spreading. This was my job, my sacred obligation.
Liquidators were very often, by the communist authorities, literally dragged from their homes in the dead of night. They were also pulled directly from their workplaces. They were made to march to the military recruitment office, and then it was straight off to Chernobyl. One of them, a certain Peskatis, a young Latvian, recalled with tears in his eyes that he received the summons to Chernobyl, to the recruitment office, at the very moment he was returning home from work. This young man didn't even have a chance to say goodbye to his family, and they had no idea where he was being taken. He also described how these individuals were literally crammed into railway cars that strikingly resembled those the Soviets once used to deport our fellow countrymen to Siberia. And these people they were traveling, their families very often only found out after several days where the liquidators actually were located.
When we first arrived, the dogs were running around their homes, keeping watch and waiting for their people. We shot them in their houses, in the school, and in the garden. The animals didn't understand why we were killing them. Women screamed, children cried, cattle bellowed. Little children were deceived, told they were going to the circus. People truly believed they would return. No final words were ever spoken.
A certain Igor Chiriak, a 19-year-old who was dispatched as a liquidator into the exclusion zone. This young man once granted a very interesting interview for the pro-Kremlin propaganda station Sputnik News. He said years later, of course, that when he was summoned to the station, they told him he was going for drills and nothing bad would happen. That's how they lied to their own citizens. But Igor knew full well, already in transit, that he was heading to a dangerous place. He was working right there, at the reactor itself. Just try to imagine what it's like to work in such a place. Today, I'm just wearing a light summer shirt, a simple t-shirt. Outside, the temperature is over 20 degrees Celsius, and I'm already feeling quite hot. I simply cannot imagine myself standing at the reactor in a heavy rubber suit, like those infamous OP-1 models, wearing a gas mask, where I'd have to constantly struggle for every single breath. On top of that, water is collecting inside my mask. My body is sweating, so even more water is accumulating in this rubber suit, and all around me, there's deadly radioactive smoke. Everywhere, literally everywhere, surrounding the entire explosion, there are extremely radioactive, dangerous objects, graphite, and also fuel assemblies. These young liquidators very often had to manually lift graphite with gloves and load it onto trucks that literally could have killed them. Kiriak also spoke about how he took part in the evacuation of ordinary people across the already irradiated Pripyat River. These were residents from the Belarusian side, and he looked them directly in the eye. They didn't want to leave their homes. They didn't want to, but they absolutely had to. How many liquidators were called to clean up the blast's effects? No one knows. Different sources claim. Some say 600,000 people, others even 1 million. And what was the total number of casualties? It remains a Soviet secret. The vast majority of the liquidators didn't even live to 50 due to radiation sickness and other health problems. We must also add the children of these people to the list of victims. They also suffered. The only thing they inherited from their parents was radiation sickness. The Kremlin authorities never, I emphasize never, disclosed the true number of victims of this disaster to the public. The liquidators were people from all walks of life, teachers, ordinary laborers, and even veterans of the war in Afghanistan. The Kremlin authorities, in their wisdom, were very concerned about their safety. They generously provided them with the very best Soviet equipment, brooms, rags, and shovels. The ones who fared the worst were those who found themselves at the very top. And this certainly wasn't referring to a professional career or the heights of Kremlin power. It was about the people who were known as Biorobots. They were called that because they worked with materials where even advanced space-grade equipment failed. These were individuals dispatched to the nuclear power plant's roof tasked with using their bare hands or very basic tools to clear radioactive graphite and spent fuel rods from it. Officially, these people were volunteers, but somehow I find it hard to believe that crowds of people went to the power plant's roof with a patriotic Soviet song on their lips. Besides, the words volunteer and Soviet Union always raise certain suspicions in my mind. Officially, these people did indeed figure as volunteers, but their superiors helped the volunteers, so they sent these people to the roof. The truth about the incredibly powerful radiation doses these individuals absorbed, I believe, still remains sealed within the sarcophagus that encases the reactor. But you yourselves can easily imagine this. These people were only able to work on the roof for 30 seconds to a single minute. They would go onto the roof, count to 30 seconds, and then had to immediately leave because the radiation dose they would receive by staying any longer on the roof would prove absolutely fatal for them.
2 of them received over 25 roentgens of radiation. They had been irradiated. The next day, they were sent to a hospital in Kiev, but by evening, they were brought back with the recommendation that they be immediately sent back to their homes.
After their work was done, these people often didn't start families, they fell into DD depression, became infertile, and committed suicide. That was Chernobyl, their personal tragedy. But the explosion of the nuclear reactor also revealed one more thing: the defects and errors in the flow of information at the highest levels of Kremlin power. It was the day of the Chernobyl disaster. The world did not yet know anything about it. Swedish scientists are looking at their counters and they are in shock. A radioactive cloud is approaching their country and the counters are showing a high concentration of radiation. The BBC then reports on the radioactive cloud that is approaching Europe.
A nuclear accident in the Soviet Union, and the Soviets have admitted that it happened. The Soviet version is this: one of the atomic reactors at the Chernobyl atomic power plant near the city of Kiev was damaged.
The readings also indicate a significantly elevated level of radiation across the Polish People's Republic. And now, here is an official statement from the Moscow authorities.
A major accident occurred at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. One of the reactors sustained significant damage. Actions were initiated to mitigate the consequences of the disaster. Assistance was provided to the victims. A government commission was appointed.
Details of the Chernobyl disaster were also shared in the Soviet newspapers, but these articles were often placed right between the sports reports. And why was that? The aim was for the Soviet citizen to subconsciously downplay the gravity of what occurred in Chernobyl. The Biorobots were informed that their work would not exceed a period of 2 months. In reality, however, many of them remained there until the sarcophagus was built. One of them, a man named Bravel, an Estonian, in the Baltic magazine Delphi stated,
I'll be frank, this was the murder of individuals who had large families, but even more tragically, it included many young people who hadn't yet had the chance to start their own families. Later, it became clear that they were taking both the sick and those who absolutely should not have been conscripted or called up for service.
Josef Truskowski, one of the main characters in Pavel Secure's book Chernobyl Liquidators, recounted how he arrived in Ukraine by a military transport plane. Previously, he had been living in Latvia with his wife. He was promised that he was going for military exercises, but in reality, he found himself directly within the Chernobyl exclusion zone. What he encountered upon arriving at the location was truly horrifying. The very first thing that he clearly remembered was the sight of abandoned orchards laden with beautiful, vibrant red apples, which they were strictly forbidden to pick because consuming them could prove fatal. Truskowski found himself in the village of Stachanka, and they were explicitly prohibited from entering any of the individual farms and houses because they were warned that literally everything in their immediate surroundings could be deadly. But Truskowski decided to defy this prohibition, and upon entering a particular farm's premises, a terrifying sight unfolded before him. Dead animals lay everywhere. Radiation had killed them. Truskalski was dealing with samosioli, meaning people who had refused deportation despite the official order. He looked them directly in the eye, conversed with them, and inquired why they refused to leave. They responded that there was simply nowhere for them to go. They wished to remain in their own homes and ultimately pass away within them, and so they remained. Truskovsky's main job was car repair, but he also scraped off the top layer of irradiated soil and loaded it onto trucks. He returned from Chernobyl and for some time remained healthy, but Chernobyl never forgets. His health only began to seriously deteriorate 5 years after the catastrophe. Mikhail Gorbachev only informed his own citizens about the Chernobyl reactor explosion 2 weeks after the blast. He claimed he wanted a full and clear picture of the entire situation so that he wouldn't have to lie to anyone. But he concealed it not because he truly sought a complete understanding of the situation, but rather because he didn't want to lose face in the eyes of the West. After all, he was perceived as a leader quite willing to compromise. He didn't want to ruin his reputation. Gorbachev thanked the liquidators and he thanked the doctors. And you must know that among the medical teams there were also gynecologists, doctors who delivered babies in the Chernobyl area, but also performed abortions because the mothers of unborn children were so irradiated that there was a risk that both the mother and the child would die. But what good are these apologies really? These people to this day are still fighting for justice and the full enforcement of their compensation claims. Beyond that, they are constantly appealing for the state to help them secure medical services and also to provide assistance with their ongoing treatment. Join us next week for yet another fascinating historical journey.